Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, the executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Marcia Inhorn, who will discuss her two books, Local Babies, Global Science, Gender, Religion, and In Vitro Fertilization in Egypt, and another book, Infertility Around the Globe, New Thinking on Childlessness, Gender, and Reproductive Technologies. Welcome to Rip Rap, Marcia.
Thank you so much. Pleased to be here.
A central focus of your research is infertility, and I must say when I read your book, Infertility Around the Globe, I gained new insights into the issues you list in the rest of the title, childlessness, gender, and reproductive technologies. But how did you get interested in this research and the additional area explored in your other book that we'll discuss during this interview, Local Babies, Global Society, where you also explore the way that Westerners view fertility in the Third World?
Yeah, I'm a medical anthropologist by training and have always been interested in issues of social suffering, human suffering. And I began my research in Egypt, and there I realized that if one were to study a stigmatized health problem, it would be infertility. For infertility really causes profound, human suffering, no matter where it occurs, whether it be in the Western countries or in the Middle East or in the so-called developing countries of the world. And so I decided that this was going to be my topic, and I'm very glad it's been my topic now for probably about 15 years. I think I've been working on infertility because it's a lens really to view many other aspects of human social life, such as gender relations, including marital relations, issues of healthcare seeking and how people interact with a medical system, issues of religion and what's acceptable morally within different religious systems. So in that way, I think infertility is a very interesting thing for a medical anthropologist to study. And beyond that, just basically demographically, it is a significant global health problem, which I think people here don't really understand. In any human population, the sort of average rates are 8 to 12% of couples who are trying to conceive aren't able to. And in some societies around the globe, those percentages are much higher. Parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a so-called infertility belt kind of wrapped around Central and Southern Africa, in some populations, as many as 1/3 of all couples are unable to conceive. So whereas Westerners view the rest of the world as a place of overpopulation, in fact, fertility and infertility are very, very interestingly kind of interlinked in ways that we don't really often see here in the West, and that people, in fact, often keep having children until they're convinced that they're no longer infertile in some ways. So infertility, I think, is a pretty important topic, and it's an underappreciated topic for social science research, and so that's how I became interested in it.
Well, there's a couple of points with that. One is having a child in Egypt and that area of the world means. It's very important.
Yeah, in fact, I think that in many parts of the so-called developing world, having children isn't really a choice. I mean, in the West, we consider having children to be a reproductive choice, something we can time, something we can plan for. In other parts of the world, children in some ways are a necessity for a variety of different kinds of reasons. And as soon as one marries, often the expectation is that you'll have children immediately. For women, often your passage into sort of adult womanhood in a society is by becoming a mother. And similarly for men as well, in many societies, having children proves your virility, your identity as a man, and so forth. And so there are many reasons why people not only need children for sort of social reasons in a society, but also just desire children because they love them, they get great pleasure out of children. And I think that in some parts of the world, those desires and needs are probably even greater than we experience them in the West. And so that's why you see sometimes very high population growth rates in places. For example, in Egypt in the past, there have been high fertility rates. And what I realize is that for an Egyptian married couple, in my research, it's really essential that once you marry, you have children. It's expected of you, no matter your social class position. And so when it doesn't happen, usually within the first year of marriage, the tremendous social pressure begins to sort of bear down upon you from within the family. People question, why aren't you having children? Why aren't you having children? Your in-laws are sort of looking at you in a particular way, community members. It begins to build, and so people feel a tremendous social onus. And I think one of the things that our book, Infertility Around the Globe, which I edited with one of my Dutch colleagues, Frank van Balen, really, each of the chapters, many of the chapters in this book, attest to the fact that if there is a gender burden of infertility, it really rests more squarely on the shoulders of women around the world. Women, because they bear the visible signs of pregnancy, they're the ones who are often immediately blamed for the reproductive failure. All sorts of unfortunate consequences can ensue for women, from marital duress, separation, divorce, those kinds of things, harassment. Often there are very negative views of infertile women. So it can be a tremendous source of social suffering, particularly for women. Also for men. I have to mention here that men, even though there's a widespread assumption that infertility is a woman's problem physiologically, about half, or actually more than half, of all cases of infertility involve a so-called male factor. Male infertility is the world's big secret, sort of a taboo topic. People don't really speak about it, but in fact, in some societies, there is severe male factor infertility, so often we can't just assume that infertility stems from the woman. And actually, I must say the direction of my current research is in the area of men and infertility and reproductive health, because I think that's a topic that's been really ignored.
Well, I thought it was interesting, an option of adopting children is not as viable in Egypt in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, adoption is interesting. In studies or in discussions of infertility in the U.S., for example, people say, oh, that's unfortunate the couple can't have children. Why don't they adopt? Adoption in the West is seen as the sort of natural solution, or the thing that you do if you're unfortunate and you can't have your own children. Even though I must say, even in the West, it's becoming much more difficult for couples to adopt. There are often significant expenses and so forth. But adoption is more or less socially acceptable, although it's probably seen as less than ideal by many couples. There are parts of the world where there really is no adoption as we know it in the West, and that would include the Muslim countries, which stretch from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, through North Africa, through the Arabian sort of peninsula and Gulf, into India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so forth. So the sort of Muslim part of the world is a very large part of the world. And in the Islamic scriptures, in the Quran, there is a great deal of discussion about the importance of taking care of orphans. Great deal of discussion about the kindness that you should give to orphans in bringing them up and so forth. But it is absolutely stated that you can raise an orphan, but you cannot give the child your name. There can be no legal fiction as to the child's surname. And so it really is a religious legal prohibition against adoption as we know it in the West, where the child becomes a sort of fictive member of your family. So adoption just doesn't work in the Muslim world. There are sort of permanent fostering arrangements that some couples engage in, and sometimes people will take children from within the family and raise them and so forth. But adoption isn't the solution in Egypt and in the Muslim parts of the world. And this is true of other parts of the world too, where adoption just isn't considered to be something culturally acceptable. And so you end up, that's what makes infertility all the more poignant in a way. When you don't have adoption as an option, all you can do is sort of strive to get treated for the infertility or to overcome the infertility. And it really creates a lot of social pressure on people to overcome their infertility through various kinds of medical and traditional medical solutions.
Well, as we were talking about before the interview, this is one of the more difficult books to read, not because of the complexity, but just because of the suffering that these people were going through that you were interviewing. And one of the things you were doing was some pretty serious ethnographic research of what they call test tube baby making.
Yeah, in fact, I first, in Egypt, I first worked in Alexandria, Egypt, some years ago, doing a very general study of infertility among mostly poor Egyptian women. And even at that time, this was in the late 1980s, test tube baby making, so-called in vitro fertilization, IVF, had just come to Egypt in 1986. Not in Alexandria where I was working, but it had been introduced in a clinic in Cairo. And in 1987, Egypt's first test tube baby was born, a little girl who actually, interestingly, her parents went public later with her birth. Her name's Heba Mohammed. She was born, and sort of slowly, by the early to mid-1990s, IVF had taken off in Egypt in a big way, as it had in some other parts of the Middle Eastern Muslim world, so that by 1999 there were about 40 IVF centers in Egypt, mostly in the cities, Cairo, Alexandria, mostly private clinics where people went at considerable expense to make their test tube babies. And so when I was first in Alexandria, I realized this is what was going to happen in Egypt. IVF was going to come to the country. And so I decided that the next time I would go back, I'd really focus on studying IVF and how in vitro fertilization might be a little different in Egypt than it's practiced in the West. And indeed, it turned out to be different in lots of ways.
We talk about the difference in how these technologies are interpreted. What works in the West may work in the in Egypt, but it's interpreted differently.
Mm-hmm. In fact, the whole notion of reproductive biology, the way that we understand reproductive biology in the West, is in fact kind of a Western script of reproductive biology, which has come into our sort of understanding in relatively recent historical period, where you had the invention of the microscope and embryology and genetics, and eventually we realized that there are gametes. There's the male gamete, the sperm, the eggs. They unite, and we understand this is a sort of duogenetic model of inheritance where there's equal weight from the male and female gametes. And among, I would say, lesser educated Egyptians, basically this isn't their understanding of reproductive physiology, if you will. There's a very deep historical notion that can actually be traced back to the Pharaonic period in Egypt, that basically, in the book, I've used the term monogenesis. That was not my term. It was actually used in Turkey by another anthropologist working in rural Turkey, but the notion that only one person in the couple actually gives life to the child, and basically it's a male model of reproduction. If you look at it, basically fetuses, the creation of the life, the baby, happens in the male and then is passed to the woman's body, and that the woman is basically like a vessel, nurtures the fetus that the man creates and passes to her. And so this has been shown in various places in what you might call more traditional segments of Middle Eastern society, that there's this notion of sort of one-sided creation. And that I had discovered in my earlier work in Alexandria, but I realized that creates difficulties when reproductive technology like IVF enters a country that has this very strong theory, procreative theory of how reproduction occurs, because IVF is absolutely based on a Western reproductive biological model. Because what they do in vitro fertilization is basically surgically extract, they harvest eggs from a woman, they take sperm from a man in a laboratory where you can't see what's going on. They put the sperm and eggs back together in a petri dish and let them fertilize, or now they have ways of forcing them to fertilize, and then they take the pre-embryo or the embryo and basically, sometimes surgically or otherwise, they put it back into the woman's uterus or the fallopian tube. And it absolutely is an idea that if you don't believe in the presence of women's eggs, for example, it's shocking to learn that a woman has eggs and that these things can be manipulated and so forth. So in a place like Egypt, for people of the lower classes, lesser educated people who haven't been educated in Western reproductive biology, I found that IVF really is a problematic technology for them. They have great misconceptions and misgivings about using it. They believe it's not a sort of natural, God-given way to conceive and so forth.
Well, I actually found it kind of fascinating that in the West, things are taken for granted almost. We have technology, why not use it? Let's not think about it. But we actually do have feelings and thoughts and concerns, and I thought that you talked about the notion of constraints in Egypt, and they do have constraints or concerns about the use of the technology, how it's organized, who's going to do it, and how, how long can they go before they run out of money.
Absolutely.
But those are all parts of actually getting this done.
Yeah, and in fact, what I found through the ethnographic research, I went there to study in vitro fertilization and how it was interpreted and practiced in Egypt, and really what emerged from the data is that the couples who were accessing this technology, very much wanting to access the technology because they often had long-term intractable cases of infertility, they desired the technology, but they were just faced with innumerable, what I called arenas of constraint, ultimately. And each chapter of the book outlines yet one more constraint. So I have 8 chapters sort of going from economic constraints to some of these constraints of knowledge that we've just talked about, to issues of efficacy, that no matter where you go, these are rather unsuccessful technologies in terms of percentages of people who actually succeed, and that probably the levels are even lower in a place like Egypt, where there are various problems with, sometimes the quality of the lab and so forth. So I just had to keep enumerating yet one more constraint, and basically, in my interviews, I had long interviews with sometimes women alone, sometimes couples together, and with very little prompting on my part, I'd ask them about their experience. And it was really, painful to hear these long stories about all kinds of problems people had accessing to the technologies. For example, at the time that I was working in Egypt, some of the very powerful hormonal drugs that are used to stimulate the woman's egg production were simply not available in the country. You couldn't get the drugs, and so women and men were desperately searching all the pharmacies in Egypt. They describe their sort of nighttime drives through Egypt looking for a pharmacy that might have the medicine, and they sometimes then have to call relatives here and there to try to bring it to them by airplane and so forth. And so I really, my sort of theoretical handle on in the book is that when a technology like in vitro fertilization, which we take for granted, successful, we have all these narratives of progress, that this is a great, miraculous technology. When you take it and you introduce it, it globalizes, and you take it to countries all over the world, you have to look at what goes on at the local level, how it's received, and also some of the constraints to the use of the technology. And that's really what I found in Egypt, is that people were struggling with many constraints on the use of the technology.
We probably ought to talk a little bit about the success rate, or what do you want to call it, the effective rate, because
Right.
there's so many different factors in it, and it's not very high, even in the best of situations.
Yeah, even in the best centers of the West, if you took sort of global averages, if you really took a global average, probably in vitro fertilization and its counterparts, there's some sort of newer variants of IVF, the success rates are somewhere between 20 and 25%, or 20 and 30%, sort of on average, assuming that things are working well in, the IVF center. And some centers have clearly gotten their success rates to be higher than that. So you can, in some centers, talk about 40%, even 50%, but again, it depends on the kinds of patients that are being accepted in those centers. Unfortunately, around the world, it's been shown that couples who've got more difficult infertility problems, including couples of older age where their gametes, or especially for women, their egg quality isn't so good, lots of clinics just reject them out of hand, actually won't accept them as clients. And so, basically, if you select young, relatively healthy couples, yeah, you may have a 40% success rate, but generally speaking, it's less than half of all couples definitely are going to succeed in this technology, no matter where you go. And sometimes couples, as I say, depending on the situation, can be older and have very difficult long-term problems where the success rates are really quite low. And so I encountered people in Egypt, and subsequently I've just come back from doing a study in Lebanon where their chances of success were really, really low. And sometimes the doctors were honest with them and said, you have less than a 10% chance of succeeding with this technology. And what I found in Egypt was one of the constraints, actually, was the the sort of gross misreporting of success rates.
Right.
That basically there's a lot of rate inflation. It's a competitive environment now between different IVF clinics, and everyone wants to claim that they have a higher success rate than the next clinic. And so sometimes you see these extraordinary claims of success being made, which are basically false advertising. There's no other way around it. So.
Well, and it was the cost, both in psychic and physical and economic, on both the man and the woman as they're going through it. That was pretty incredible. These so-called success rates are after repeated tries and what they go through.
Yeah, so actually IVF is said to be a therapy that becomes more successful the more willing you are to actually repeat the therapy. And so within 3 trials, there's going to be, the success rates will get higher if people are willing to repeat. The problem is repetition is extremely costly, and the thing that's interesting about Egypt as a country, and why I found it an interesting place to do this research, is that Egypt now has more than 70 million people, and it's like it was the Muslim country that actually was the first one willing to actually enact a population reduction control program way back in the 1960s. So you've got this sort of attention to fertility in the country, no attention to infertility, even though it's been estimated that minimally 12% of Egyptian couples are infertile, are struggling with infertility, and in a country of more than 70 million people, that's thousands of people. I mean, it's more than 1 million people who basically make up the potential clientele of these now 50, as of 2003, there are 50 IVF clinics in Egypt. But what I found in 1996 is that really the only people who were able to access these technologies were what I would call the Egyptian elite. They were middle, but really mostly upper middle to upper class Egyptians. Some of them sort of traditional elites in the society. A lot of them had become upper middle class through education, and then they had gone to the Arab Gulf countries to basically work at better salaries, and this is how they made money in order to come back and do their IVF. And so I was there working in the summer, which is a sort of holiday time for people in the Middle East, and there was a huge influx of Egyptian expatriates coming back from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and so forth, who I came to think of if they were coming back on their IVF holidays to Egypt. As soon as they hit the tarmac of the airport, they're on their way to the IVF clinic to start the cycle, because it takes minimally a month to do an IVF cycle. But these were elites, and so they were able to pay the cost of a cycle, which at that time in 1996 was about $2,500 to $3,000 US, which in a country where the per capita GNP is under $1,000 per person, per year, the salaries are just, to be an average salaried person in Egypt, you could never afford these technologies. And people lamented that. I mean, I heard hours of people saying, these technologies are not for everyone, because it's the rare person in Egypt who would be able to purchase this technology. So at that time it was really very much restricted to elites. Now Egypt has a couple of sort of semi-state subsidized IVF programs that are catering to sort of an underclass of rural and urban poor people, but they're few and far between.
Well, in the book you talked about how people would come back to Egypt, like you were saying, because of various reasons, religious and the relationship they had with the doctor. Yeah,
well, Egyptians, I think, not surprisingly, are very patriotic about Egypt, and Egypt actually is a country with a very long medical tradition, which again dates back literally 5,000 years, but Egypt also had a sort of a system of British colonial medicine, and it was a country that has sort of been on the forefront of Western biomedicine, if you will, for some time, and so it has a good reputation in terms of the capability of its doctors, and it has something like, I think about 14, actually there are some newer medical schools, maybe something like 17 medical schools. So there are a lot of doctors in Egypt. A lot of the doctors are well trained. They get training outside of their country. And Egyptian couples are very concerned about having a doctor that they trust, who they feel is competent and skilled. And also Egypt, getting into the aspect of religion, which is very, very important for, I think, Muslims, and probably for many people, but definitely in the Middle East it's important. In Egypt, which is about a 90% Sunni Muslim country, the Egyptian IVF patients are very concerned about having a good Sunni Muslim religious doctor. And so they spent many hours talking to me about the importance of choosing a physician, not only a Muslim physician, but one who you could trust as an ethical person, who wasn't greedy, who wasn't mercenary, and so forth. They did major character assessments of their doctors in ways that were really sort of eye-opening, because in some senses, this isn't just any medical procedure. This is the person who is going to help make your baby for you, and you must trust that this person is completely capable, trustworthy, moral, and so forth.
So they really did develop relationships with these doctors.
Yeah, I have to say I worked in a couple of clinics, IVF clinics. The major part of my study was in 2 IVF clinics where really I could only describe it as sort of a charismatic cult of personality around the 2 clinical directors at these 2 clinics. Their names were Dr. Muhammad Yahya and Dr. Salah Zaki, both very gentle, intelligent, kind people who dealt with their patients in a very honest and straightforward manner. And I used to hear a lot about, there is a lot of bad news in IVF, but these doctors knew how to tell people sort of bad news in a empathic but straightforward manner. And so much of the interview surrounded about how these patients just loved these doctors, these 2 doctors, and many of them had had very bad experiences with other doctors. And in fact, there's a sort of cycle of doctor shopping that I think is true in the world of IVF in general. You don't succeed one place, well, you go try to find another clinic, another doctor who you like better, who you feel more comfortable with. But there was a lot of character judgment going on, and it was really important to people that they felt comfortable with their doctor.
In your book, you said you hope to open a window of understanding into a world that's been shuttered from our view, a place where brave moral pioneers experience both the profound suffering and the occasion of life-altering joys there at the heart of this issue. So,
yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, I think there are so many misunderstandings and misconceptions about Islam as a religion, about the Middle East as a place, about the lives of Muslims. Unfortunately, in the Western media, really all we hear about is, religion, politics, violence, and that religion is somehow connected to violence. And I mean, honestly, Islam is a tolerant and generally peaceful religion practiced by millions of people around the world. And I think, my contribution to the discussion of Islam, I mean, if I've made a contribution, is to look at just sort of the everyday lives of Muslims who are, grappling with a medical, problem and trying to overcome it in a religiously and morally acceptable way that is different from our understandings in the West. And I think one of the things that I found was a very tolerant discussion of Egyptian Muslims' understandings of our moral world. I mean, I talk a lot in the book about sort of local moral worlds, that they have misconceptions about morality in the U.S. based on media misrepresentations and the kinds of programs they see on television, in their country that are imported from the West. So,
well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed talking with you this evening.